Welcome back, focused learners. Let's jump right in, because today's explainer is literally going to change how you listen to the news, how you read policy proposals, and honestly, how you understand the political debates happening all around us. We're unpacking how political rhetoric actually manipulates our agreement on these broad, feel-good aspirations just to sneak in some highly controversial policies. It's like looking at the hidden architecture of an argument, and we're going to break the whole thing down right now. Okay, let's dive into this. Pretty much every political argument, no matter which side of the aisle it's coming from, kicks off with universally shared goals. We're talking affordable housing, decent healthcare, good jobs. I mean, who on earth is going to argue against safe communities or strong American industry? Nobody, right? These phrases are incredibly useful in politics because they describe these end goals that command just enormous, almost universal agreement across the entire political spectrum. But here's the catch. That whole illusion of total agreement, it shatters the absolute second a politician uses one specific word. And that word is therefore. It goes like this. Housing is too expensive, therefore something must change. Healthcare costs too much, therefore the system must be reformed. Up to this point, we're all nodding along. But that pivot from a universally loved goal to a highly specific, highly consequential action happens right there at that exact word. So here is our roadmap for this explainer. We'll cover the politics of broad agreement, the Mott and Bailey maneuver, which government should have power, overlapping on the federal axis, and finally the political enemy test. Starting with Section 1, the politics of broad agreement. Now, what's really interesting about this concept is how a medieval castle perfectly maps onto modern political debates. Back in the day, a Mott and Bailey was this two-part castle. You had the Bailey, that was the broad, lower enclosure where everyday life happened, super useful but incredibly hard to defend from attackers. Then you had the Mott. This was the smaller, elevated, highly fortified tower up on a hill. Pretty useless for daily life, but incredibly safe. When attackers swarmed the Bailey, everyone just retreated up to the Mott. Well, in a political debate, this exact same thing happens. A controversial policy is the Bailey. When it inevitably gets attacked, the defender retreats up the hill to a safe, universally accepted moral claim, the Mott. Which brings us to Section 2, the Mott and Bailey maneuver. Let's picture how this plays out. Imagine someone proposes a massive, controversial government intervention, like, say, a highly specific housing program. That's step 1, right down there in the Bailey. Now, step 2, you ask a totally fair, practical question. You push back on the cost or maybe the zoning logistics, and then step 3 hits. The proponent instantly retreats to the Mott and says, well, why are you against this? Don't you care about the homeless? Notice what just happened there. The practical proposal just vanished. It was entirely replaced by a moral judgment about you, the critic. The debate completely shifted from a specific institutional mechanism to whether or not you're a decent human being. Moving to Section 3, which government should have power? Because before we can even begin to safely debate those policies down in the Bailey, we've got to settle a deeply American question. It's not just about how much government we want, but which government. Whenever you hear an aspiration that literally everyone agrees on, you have to run it through this ultimate filter. How will this be done? By whom? And at what level? Asking these 3 questions is absolutely your best tool for cutting right through all that thick fog of political abstraction. Think about it like this. A local city loosening its zoning laws, a state subsidizing construction, and Washington imposing national rent controls. Yes, those are all government actions, but they are definitely not the same action just performed at different volumes. They operate at completely different scales. Same with healthcare. Supporting a city-owned hospital doesn't mean you automatically support a massive national healthcare system. Local actions let residents vote against them, or move away, or watch competing approaches play out. Concentrating power at the federal level changes the accountability entirely. Let's apply this to what we'll call the federal axis. Forget the traditional left versus right spectrum for a second. Imagine a totally different axis. Because our core concern here isn't just some generic enthusiasm for government in the abstract, it's specifically the willingness to concentrate economic authority in Washington. We're moving from decentralized choices made by individuals and local cities all the way over to highly centralized power in D.C. And that leads us to Section 4, overlapping on the federal axis. Now, on the left, you have the Democratic Socialist moat. It's built on incredibly accessible moral aspirations, right? Equality, worker security, economic dignity. Then, on the right, the Trump Republican moat is built on totally different, yet equally sturdy aspirations. American jobs, domestic manufacturing, competing with China.
Look, their philosophies, their rhetoric, their voters, they are entirely different. They are flying totally different flags over their respective castles. And this brilliantly illustrates the real twist of modern politics. Different mots can overlook the same bailey. Even though the moral justifications up on the hill are fiercely opposed to each other, both sides use those high ground arguments to justify the exact same actions down in the bailey, centralizing economic power in Washington. Whether it's through industrial subsidies, massive tariffs, or federal direction of capital, both sides are leaning on Washington to protect, direct, and control. So two movements that are bitter enemies on the conventional left-right spectrum actually end up occupying the exact same territory when it comes to using federal economic power. This whole dynamic is made possible by something called coalition technology. Phrases like bring manufacturing back or affordable housing are brilliant coalition technologies. They allow people with wildly different ideas about how to actually run the government to stand united under the exact same moral banner. The ambiguity is literally the glue. The broad aspiration holds the coalition together strictly because it postpones that messy, divisive argument about the actual institutional means.
Finally, Section 5. The political enemy test. Eventually, that ambiguity has to end, because governing inevitably requires action. So how do we arm ourselves against these rhetorical tricks? Well, we can use a toolkit inspired by George Orwell. He famously warned us that political language makes concrete exercises of power sound completely benign by using abstract nouns. So our best defense is purely grammatical. Ask for the verb. When a politician says they want a strategic investment, look for the verb. It usually means subsidize. When they promise affordability, the verb is often restrict or control. And economic security, that can hide the verb own. Always, always remember this rule. Nouns tell us what we hope for, but verbs tell us what will actually happen. The noun is what keeps everyone feeling warm and fuzzy, safely fortified up in the mott, but the verb forces the argument all the way back down into the reality of the bailey, where power is actually exercised, money is actually spent, and rules are actually enforced. So the crucial point is to keep repeating this refrain. By all means, agree on the moral destination. Of course, we want affordable housing and good jobs, but please do not confuse agreeing on the destination with consenting to the route. Whenever you hear a universally beloved goal, force the conversation to the verbs. Ask, how will this policy actually work? By whom will it be carried out? And at what level of government will that authority reside? And if the answer to what level is the federal government in Washington, you've got to ask yourself this one final massive question. Would I willingly give this exact power to the politician I distrust the most? Because the power you create in the bailey today does not change when the office holder changes. Only our feelings about who controls it do. So think about that the next time you hear a politician make a grand promise. Thanks for joining me on this Explainer, Focus Learners. Keep asking for those verbs, and I'll see you in the next one.